So I am Jennifer Biddle. I'm an associate professor in the School of Marine Science and Policy. And today I have with me Dr. Jonathan Sharp. So if you would introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Sharp. I'm Professor Emeritus of Oceanography from what was formerly called the College of Marine Studies. I retired in 2014 and have not remained very active with the science part of this, but have been very active in the years since then with science communication at national and international meetings, trying to teach scientists how to communicate better with the public, working with Hollywood to do so.
So we can start off talking a bit about your career. What about your career surprises you in terms of the overall trajectory about it? And can you describe sort of your career arc in terms of what you went through?
Yeah, I'm not too sure what surprises me. I guess going back even to high school days, I always had a very strong interest in science, but also a strong interest in humanities. I did my BA degree at Lehigh University, and I had to actually petition the biology department to allow me to substitute 4 biochemistry courses from the chemistry department for the courses I hadn't taken in biology. Now today they actually do have a biochemistry degree there, but at the time I sort of created the first one. In addition to biology and chemistry, I had a very strong interest in philosophy and literature, and actually won a campus-wide award for outstanding essay on T.S. Eliot's Cocktail Party is a play. I also published poetry in a literature magazine at Lehigh at the time. I stayed at Lehigh to do my MS degree in 1967, also in the biology department, which I got in about a year and a half. I did not have a thesis, but instead published 4 papers in the refereed literature. I then went on to Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, graduating in 1972 with a PhD in oceanography. My original intent was to fast track through, not take too much time, but I ended up with the most ship time of any oceanography student in the history of Dalhousie. I participated on the Hudson 70 expedition, which was an amazing trip. It was the first and I believe only ship to circumnavigate the Americas, leaving Halifax in November 1969, sailing down to the Antarctic and the Atlantic, through the Straits of Magellan, around to the Antarctic and the Pacific, and straight up, at the time, the longest south to north line, 150-degree longitude line from the Antarctic ice pack up into the Arctic, and then going into Vancouver. Then sailed through the Northwest Passage and was made it through the Northwest Passage, so it circumnavigated the Americas. I'd say probably the only one, because I'm not sure anyone else would ever want to do that for any special reason. Although today the Northwest Passage is opened up so you can actually do it. At the time, the entire Canadian government icebreaker fleet was there sort of escorting the Hudson through to make sure they could make it. I was on the cruise from the Rio de Janeiro to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and then from Valparaiso, Chile to Vancouver with a stopover in Tahiti. I was young and single at the time, and it was really a lot of fun traveling around like that. In fact, after 2 months at sea, I came into Vancouver, then flew off to Honolulu to visit some friends at the University of Hawaii. I did postdoctoral work at Scripps Institution of Oceanography from 1972-73, working in what was really the, sort of an almost infamous group called the Food Chain Research Group, which was an interesting combination of biology, chemistry, physics, all sort of wrapped into an interdisciplinary type of study. While at Scripps, I had 2 expeditions from San Diego to Honolulu, or actually 2 in one case, and then from Honolulu back to San Diego. So lots, again, of free time at sea. Although it was while I was at Scripps that I met my now wife, Gwyneth, at a cocktail party where her date had actually a little bit too much to drink and some drugs and passed out. So I met her and was introduced by a friend, Angelo Carlucci, a famous microbiologist who was also incidentally a dwarf. So it was really an interesting meeting. Much of my early career was influenced actually by two algal identification people. Ruth Patrick, who probably many people know of, one of the most famous, she was a diatom specialist, but also the Ruth Patrick program at the university, at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia and University of Pennsylvania is named after her. She was an amazing woman, and I actually got to know her quite well. In fact, we ran across each other somewhat surprisingly at Princeton University graduation when my son was graduating from Princeton. And it turned out that her new husband at the time, she was in her 80s, had just recently remarried. His granddaughter was actually a classmate of my son in the geology department. But it was a very interesting interaction with Ruth, and she was really a fascinating person. She was actually a very early female PhD. You know, back in the 30s, there were very few women who got PhDs in sciences. I also at that time met a man by the name of Francis Drouet, who was the world's expert on blue-green algal taxonomy, we now call cyanobacteria. And he basically spent most of his career publishing one giant treatise. And I had sort of commented, I thought it was really quite meritorious to do that. And he said, well, don't follow my example, never do something stupid like that. Publish lots of papers. I also was very strongly influenced by a biochemistry professor who had gotten my interest in biochemistry. And I worked at the time on my master's for Bill Sutcliffe, who was the director of what was then called the Bermuda Biological Station. And Bill was an interesting character, to say the least. I met and was influenced by really some of the greatest oceanographers in history. My PhD advisor was Gordon Riley, who is really one of the most outstanding biological, chemical, physical oceanographers of all time. Also, Pete Wengerski, who was, in addition to being the founding editor of the Oceanography magazine, he was also one of the most amazing polymaths that I've ever run across, having fascinating interest in mathematics and all sorts of things outside of chemical oceanography, which is his expertise. I had brief run-ins or brief meetings at that time with Alfred Redfield. Redfield, probably one of the great oceanographers, one of the founders of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I was in Bermuda in the summer, and he was there for a board of directors meeting. And I had a collection trip going all around the island, and he asked if he and his daughter could go along. His daughter was in her 60s. And I was actually doing what one should not do, was actually scuba diving all alone, getting samples. And every time I would come up, he would sort of lean over the side and say, "What did you find?" And he basically epitomized scientific curiosity. You know, his eyes were just sort of glistened and just was fascinated by everything. I also got to meet Buck Ketchum at the time, who was really one of the mainstreams, and Francis Richards. And in my mind, one of the great papers of all times is the paper by Buck, Redfield, Ketchum, and Richards on sort of biogeochemistry. I got fairly friendly also at the time with Charlie Yench, who, among other things, was the founder of Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. And again, Charlie just had this fascinating interest in science. And at one point I commented, I said, I really thought that Bigelow Laboratory was really well run. And he said, oh, so I was trying to make that transparent. I'm pretending not to actually run it, it's just science. Anyway, you had asked about a research career. From the beginning of my career, I became heavily involved with monitoring activities. And I've actually tried throughout my career to show that monitoring really is a fundamental research activity, or can be. I explored and published the database from the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is now at probably close to 75 years old, one of the largest, longest time sequence measurements in the world. The database had been used to help guide the cleanup of the Delaware River, just looking exclusively at dissolved oxygen. And I just found a gold mine of other data there and really tried to explain the whole dynamics of the cleanup of the river. It was really a very interesting thing. And in many ways, the cleanup of the Delaware was probably one of the most outstanding estuarine cleanups in the world, similar to the cleanup of the Thames downstream from London. But I think the Delaware was much better documented because we really had all the details. I remember early on, pointing out the fact that one of the big emphasis in the cleanup was a drop in ammonium nitrogen, but not disappearing to nitrogen, but converting it to nitrate, and trying to point out that this was very important, and originally had the comments of people saying, well, that doesn't really have anything to do with what happened. And I tried to point out the whole dynamic of the biogeochemical interaction of nitrogen, also got into phosphorus and silicon and the dynamics of the cleanup. I became very much involved, actually developed my own 35-year-long database on the Delaware. And I became very heavily involved in world ocean carbon studies and headed up an international calibration effort for dissolved organic carbon measurements. At the time, really the only things that had much standardization in terms of international measurements were salinity and dissolved oxygen. And it was really an interesting, fun activity with the dissolved organic carbon, over which I eventually had about 75 participants from all over the world involved in the effort. Throughout my career, I had a relatively modest publication history. I I guess, ignored suggestions that you should publish or perish, and instead sort of felt it was important to actually have people read your papers rather than just count them. So I really feel that several of my papers were extremely highly referenced throughout the world. And actually, I keep getting things now from Elsevier Press of people citing a paper I published back in the 1980s, I think, or 70s. So I was really very pleased with that. You had asked about students. I really had was very fortunate to have an amazing group of students. I had a philosophy throughout that students should not be my research technicians. And I basically said, you must develop your own research effort and turn it into what you want. And in many cases, refused to even co-publish with them, say, publish this alone as a sole author. Among my students were Rick Coffin, who is, I think, now the head of the science program at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi, Texas. Luis Cifuentes. Luis went on to be actually provost at Texas A&M in College Station, and then was acting vice president at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi, and was sort of forced out of office by a woman who sort of took over as a new president. And Luis moved on to become the vice president director of research at New Mexico State University in Corpus Christi. And is really a very, very good program there. He is using his sort of philosophy, again, of getting people to develop their own approaches, and has had a very, very successful effort there. Has personally headed up effort bringing in tremendous amounts of research money for the entire program there. I also had a number of other interesting students who, several of them had careers totally unrelated to what they were trained for. One of them, Lou Fox, became very, very heavily involved in data management, totally outside of environmental science. Steve Compton was a very eccentric student who eventually became a extremely well-respected private school professor. Someone else I was thinking of. Pete Underhill. Pete did his master's with me, then went on, worked at University of Hawaii for a while, and then came back and did his PhD with me. He had a sort of disastrous loss of a love life. A girlfriend went off with his roommate, and he sort of fell apart for a while, but then somehow decided to go out to Stanford. His parents had just moved to Palo Alto, and there was a program teaching genetic engineering there. And he went to them and said, well, I don't have an employer to pay my fee to it, but I will work for you for free if you let me come into the course. He did that and then actually started working. I can't remember the guy's name now, but anyway, he's got into human genetics and is actually one of the world's experts on evolutionary human evolution genetics. So really it's quite an amazing group of students. What obstacles did I have to overcome? I really don't feel like I had an awful lot of obstacles. I just say that maybe obstacles were opportunities. Basically have to work harder and work around anything that would make it be less effective.
I wonder if you can mention at all, the facilities must have changed during your time at UD fairly significantly. Yes. So can you mention a little bit about the changes you saw in the facility?
Right. When I first got to CMS, we had actually, I came for an interview, and the program was over on Beach Plum Island. So I had to actually take a ferry across to get to where, or not a ferry, a boat across to get to the place. By the time I got there, they had opened what is now called PEL as the main office building. Actually, I think it was called the temporary main office building. So I had an office there, but then I took over the entire building at Beach Plum Island as my laboratory. So I would have to go from my office to my lab by boat. And then there was the plan to build the Cannon laboratory. And it was sort of interesting. I was brought in towards the end of the initial plan before the building was started. And there were these plans for the laboratories. And I said, well, these don't look like they make any sense. They're sort of cookbook laboratories. And it turns out that Tom Church, who was really became a very, very close, great colleague of mine, had been asked in sort of the 11th hour to sort of take this thing. And it was all these sort of cookbook things for laboratories where you would have a laboratory that has 50 drawers and cabinets that all had keys to them, and just all sorts of really silly things. So what we couldn't change, what Tom and I couldn't change, we finally found, all right, what we do is we will take all these cabinets and drawers, unlock them, take all the keys, put them together in another door, lock it up, and only he and I knew where the keys were to that, so people couldn't lock them up any longer. Anyway, the Cannon lab was not designed by people who were going to use it. So we'd made a lot of efforts throughout the years to basically redesign and rebuild all the laboratories to make them more practical. I initially had the laboratory, actually I initially had where you are, your office, which was connected to where, who's next to you now?
Andrew Wozniak is next to me now.
Right, how about, okay.
Kathy's on the other side.
Katerina Billups is on the end, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all three of those offices were mine. They were connected with a doorway between them.
It's still there, yeah.
And going down from where Katerina is downstairs was a spiral staircase to get down the laboratory.
Whoa, that's not there anymore.
No, I actually had that taken out.
So you mentioned your efforts to standardize DOC concentrations to measure dissolved organic carbon.
Right.
And when I started at UD, everyone always said that your lab had the best water. And I was wondering if you could remember about what it took to get the best water for chemistry, and any thoughts.
Yes, I do. I spent a lot of time on that. Basically, I found that you could make the best water in the world, but you couldn't store it. It would not. I went through double, triple distillation type of activities, doing all sorts of things to make it ultra pure, but it just really wasn't storable. So what we did then was to start to make this really clean water and then immediately put it in ampules and seal the ampules. And I did those as a zero reference, and then where dissolved organic carbon ampules had measured amounts of carbon in them, I basically would set this up and then send them off to about 5 independent laboratories to analyze them and sort of get a group analysis of what the carbon concentration was and what the not totally zero concentration of the distilled water was. So I started this effort and then actually set up a system through National Science Foundation support to provide these throughout the world. Probably don't need to mention the name, but someone else decided he wanted to take over that program and essentially sort of pushed it out from underneath me to his laboratory afterward. But anyway, we did start that effort, which continues today. And it is one that I don't think is being maintained as well as we tried to do it. But that is sort of the way things happen in science. They don't always continue like you'd like them to be.
Yeah, that actually brings us up to this idea of sort of research being a journey. And
I'm sorry, what?
That research is a journey. Can you think of any sort of times that you definitely picked the road less traveled, or that you purposely changed directions because of personal interests or important things that needed to get done?
Not really. I mean, I just have always had, I guess, a tremendous diversity of interests and tried to maintain them. But I really, again, I would say I didn't find a lot of obstacles. I just found challenges sometimes that had to be worked around.
Can you talk about any specific people at UD that had the greatest impact on your time here?
Well, actually, an interesting comment again on Tom Church. When I was originally given the offer to come here, I also had an offer to go to University of Georgia, and decided that one might be better because really there were very few people at Delaware. It was sort of a struggling beginning place, where the University of Georgia effort was really very well established, and had been very interested. I had gotten to know Larry Pomeroy, who was a very well-known marine microbiologist who, when I was at Scripps doing postdoctoral work, he came and said, I would like to hire you to come to Georgia. And I said, well, I just started here, come back and see me in 2 years. He came back to see me in about a year and a half and said, made me an offer. I initially accepted that, turned down the offer at Delaware. And my wife, Gwen, had said, well, I guess we're going to have to get a divorce because I refused to go to Georgia. So I called Tom Church and said, Tom, I want to take back my refusal. I want to come to Delaware. So fortunately, it was able to happen. But that was an interesting, almost diversion in the wrong direction.
So I wonder if you could talk a bit about your efforts. I know you have made huge efforts with working with oceanography societies and other agencies to get scientists to communicate better. And so can you talk about where that came from and what you've done with it?
Yeah, it was actually an interesting thing that I've quoted, and I've never had a response from the person involved, but there was a very well-known geochemist at Princeton, whose name escapes me for a moment, but he, at the time this came up, Michael Crichton, the MD novelist who wrote it wasn't the Hot Zone, it was one of these science fiction things. Anyway, he had become a climate skeptic. And I was just really frustrated and confused by this. The geochemist, for instance, was George Philander. And he gave a plenary talk at a oceanography meeting one time. And he said, Michael Crichton, is trained as a doctor, said he studied climate change for years, and he's a skeptic. And he looked around and he said, what are we doing wrong? And it really hit me, though, that we would sort of wring our hands and say, oh, these people are all dumb or stupid, but we weren't trying to understand why they had their viewpoints or trying to give them a positive reason to rethink it. And that's what got me involved. I got involved early on with Randy Olson, who was independent, a PhD marine biologist, or actually got a PhD at Harvard in evolutionary biology, and then became an independent filmmaker in Hollywood. He had a well-known film called Flock of Dodos, the Intelligent Design Evolution Circus. And I just started working with Randy to try to figure out how we can better train sciences. And one of the things that was obvious is that the scientists were being sort of haughty and not at all understanding of anything that disagreed with them. It's sort of, I'm the expert, just listen to me. So through Randy, I also got involved with Brian Palermo, who I continue to be involved with, and Brian's become a good friend. And Brian had a quote he made early on, which I love. He says, get them to laugh and they'll listen to anything. To get people to pay attention to you, they have to think you're a human being. And that really one of the most important things is to basically get them to recognize that you're a normal human being like them, and that really, I don't want to tell you what to know about environmental science. I want you to get interested and find out yourself. And I think that's really one of the big messages you have to first of all, convince your audience that you really are just one of them. And two, that this area that fascinates you is something interesting that they ought to explore. And basically, again, this is, I think, a strong influence from Randy as well, as get them to develop. I mean, part of the theme of his movies have been sort of, I don't want to tell you what to do. I want you to make your own conclusion. Look at what I've shown you, and then you decide what it is. So that I think is really one of the things that Brian and I have continued working on. We're doing a virtual workshop at this summer meeting that has been unfortunately turned into virtual rather than in-person meeting. And I actually have, today I need to actually get back with someone to try to set up some plans for workshops in the 2022 meeting. Is supposed to be in Honolulu. So hopefully we will try to put in a couple of workshops there.
Did it change the way you interacted with your own students?
No, maybe it was much of this was after I quit having students, but much of it was probably influenced by my interactions with the students originally. And I really feel that I had never had a student that I didn't learn a lot from. And I think that's, again, one of the problems in a lot of traditional college professors is I am the expert, you listen to me. And the reality is that we can all learn from everyone else. And we're really not very good scholars if we don't do that.
I agree, yeah. I wonder, in terms of thinking about how you picked students, did you have any strategy over the years in terms of how to select the right students for graduate school?
Yeah, well, actually, I got very, very involved. I started our summer marine science intern program years ago. In fact, it was the first, I was on a panel for NSF when they first started the summer intern program. And we gave advice to them. They funded 2 studies having nothing to do with oceanography. And then the second year they came around and decided they would fund the same 2 areas. And I went storming off to NSF. At the time, Grant Gross was the director of ocean sciences there. And I said, Grant, oceanography is being left out. We have to change this. So the next year, the emphasis was on oceanography. So we developed a oceanography summer intern program. And I think the first year we did that, there were 3 programs. I had the one at Delaware. There was one at Woods Hole and one at William and Mary. And then we basically sort of opened it up and started getting more. So I was heavily involved in trying to recruit students into our program. And we had, I think at one of the peak years, I had something like over 200 applicants from all over the country. And we were looking for students in all areas of science. In fact, I used to go around campuses trying to recruit students and give them an idea about it. And I remember one time going to Yale and talking to someone there saying I would like to come and talk to students about students in chemistry, biology, geology, physics, engineering, math. And he said, well, we don't really do that sort of thing. And I said, what do you do? And he said, well, we have financial management and med school programs, and that's it. Those recruiters come on campus, but no one else. And then I remember, going to other places. One I actually found very interesting. Went to Stanford and was told that they weren't very interested. Period. That basically the statement there was that our faculty tell students about their own institutions they got their PhDs in, and that's the way we do graduate school referencing. And then I went to San Francisco State and found someone there who was very, very good recipient of the idea and gave talks there. But it was interesting, and going around looking at students, I often was looking for some eccentric characteristics. I used SAT scores because this was undergraduates in many cases hadn't yet taken GREs, or if they did, I looked at GRE scores as well. I looked at grade point averages and decided they were almost worthless, that most schools had tremendous inflation of their grade points. But I also had the students write essays, which I used very, very heavily. And I vividly remember this one student who said that his father was a chemistry professor. He had a brother who was a chemistry professor. He was very interested in chemistry, but he really felt that he was also interested in Spanish, Latin American poetry and some other things. And he said he just couldn't imagine, in his essay, couldn't imagine spending his life sitting in a stale laboratory. And I said, well, come join us. We have our laboratories on ships at sea. And he did come and join our intern program. He eventually went on and got a PhD, I think, at University of Washington. In fact, I sent a lot of students to University of Washington Oceanography program. And then eventually he got very interested he wanted to be a sports writer. I got interested in that and then started doing scientific writing. And then I think he became a staff writer for a Seattle newspaper. And forget where the last I saw of him, he was something totally different again. But anyway, I found that some of the students who had interests that were beyond what I was training them for were very good things to go to. I also tried to point out that if we want to have everyone go into our field, you should have one student in your career. That's about all we can afford to an expansion of a college professor. So I really early on started emphasizing that there are a lot of other really good things to do with a PhD in oceanography. And I had students who became high school teachers, undergraduate college professors, say writers, and just lots of different things, not just going into the same field.
Yeah. So when we think about everything that you were able to accomplish in your career, what was it that gives you the deepest sense of pride?
I don't know, there's one single thing. I think it's basically being sort of able to do much of what I had done. And I guess really the thing that I followed up on now is a science communication is I guess one of the areas that I do find. When I first started, actually it was excuse me, interesting thing. I've been very fortunate able to get NSF support to do a lot of this stuff. And one of the early things I was doing workshop or panel discussions as well as workshops. And we had this one panel discussion at the 2008 Ocean Sciences meeting in Orlando, I think it was. And I had a panel that included Randy Olson, filmmaker, Juliet Alpern, who was a writer for the Washington Post, professor at Scripps, who's very, very big in communication type of stuff too. His name escapes me right now for the moment. Jerry Schubel, who had been provost at Stony Brook, and then went out and eventually became, and I think is still, the director of the Aquarium of the Americas, which he points out is the largest public aquarium in the world, with eventually influenced by being involved with other aquaria of billions of people all over the world. But Jerry and I got very interested again in trying to proliferate our science communication. And at the time, Leonardo DiCaprio had started getting very interested in environmental science. And we contacted his office, which turns out largely was his mother who was running things. And said that we really, he had done a little movie which was about 45 minutes long. And Jerry said, if you would let me edit this down to about 8 minutes, I can put it in aquaria all over the world and reach about 10 billion people. Well, not 10 billion, I mean 10 million people. And the response was, DiCaprio's mother basically said, no, we're not interested, we'll do it ourselves. And the thing died. I mean, never got any interest, never went anywhere. And it was sort of an interesting observation, that if we could do it the right way with brief, good communication, we could reach a lot of people. But what DiCaprio's film had is a whole bunch of talking heads, basically the typical science communication activity. And what we found in working with science communication is that most of the professional science communication groups do just that. They do the stodgy talking head activity. And we have prided ourselves in using a very different approach of really trying to get a broader audience. I mean, one of the things I pointed out is that you have what I would call the scientific American audience. They're already captured, they're already interested, they will learn on their own. And what we've been trying to do is to reach out to the people who aren't interested, the uninterested public, to get them interested and therefore be able to communicate. And really driving so much of this has been the whole climate change issue, that we really need to get people to wake up to this. And discovered over the years that there are a lot of very strong influences trying to prevent the same thing. In fact, I just got a thing from an old fraternity brother of some physicist who decided he's an environmental expert who's basically poo-pooing the whole climate change thing. Physicists seem to be good at this.
So I wonder, so we've gone through all the questions I had. Is there anything that you wanted to add that I haven't asked you about?
Not really. I guess one of the most important things is that what I've been doing, I really enjoy. And I really think that's very, very important to become dedicated to and really enjoying whatever you're doing with science.